All right, so I have to start here with a hat tip to my colleague, Allison Lent, who actually put this presentation together and is way more qualified than I to give it. She's actually our stream assessment coordinator and wasn't available today. But if anybody has any questions about anything that I present, you have both of our emails here. Allison's a great resource and is happy to answer any questions that might come up either during or after the presentation. So I am the executive director with Ulster County Soil and Water Conservation District, but for about the past 12 years, I've been the stream program or stream project manager with the Ashokan Watershed Stream Management Program. And during that time, I've had the opportunity to work on several miles of stream restoration work, a lot of it having either water quality benefit or protection of public infrastructure, habitat improvement, or oftentimes, as is the case, all three. Actually, I might flip my camera off so I don't distract people while I read my notes. Sorry. Well, forget that because I can't figure out how to get back to it. So sorry. So our program partakes in a lot of studies to understand the stream system and the stream processes that are at play in the Catskill Mountains. We work with stakeholders to address flood and erosion problems and promote stream stewardship. And one of the ways we do this is through stream assessments and the development of stream management plans. In this instance, I'm going to walk us through a case example on Woodland Creek, which is a major tributary to the upper Sopus Creek in the heart of the Catskills. So if anybody's unfamiliar, we're in the more mid-Hudson Valley region, the northwest corner of Ulster County, which is the Ashokan Watershed, which is ultimately everything that drains in to the DEP's Ashokan Reservoir. It's approximately 255 square miles in the High Peaks region of the Catskill Mountains, and it spans the political boundary of Greene and Ulster County. So we do work on occasion up in the Greene County portion of the Ashokan Watershed. It's the headwaters for the Sopus Creek, a large tributary to the Hudson River, and it includes the upper 26 miles of the Sopus Creek that flows into the reservoir, as well as the subbasins that are all identified here. We are a partnership program between three entities. New York City Department of Environmental Protection. We work very closely with their stream management staff out of the Kingston office. And then Ulster County Soil and Water, as well as Cornell Cooperative Extension of Ulster County. So both Soil and Water and CCE have staff that are specifically assigned to the stream program contract with New York City, and their office is based out of Ashokan. So just up around here. Our main programmatic goals are to protect and improve water quality. And this is really a result of the fact that this is a public drinking water supply system or reservoir system. And much of that work focuses on the glacial legacy of the last ice age, in particular, the very fine sediments that were produced under these like lacustrine or glacial lake settings. You can see an example of that in the picture here, showing how those stratified layers of clay develop and at times come in contact with the erosional forces of the streams. We also work in flood hazard mitigation and in aquatic and riparian and habitat improvement projects. So turbidity-near watershed does not have necessarily a point source of contamination. The watershed is filled with steep, high-energy streams vulnerable to erosion, especially where historic land use and channel alignment and floodplain development, such as building roads, railways, logging or past dredging activities, and cutting off floodplains with berms, have impacted the dynamic stability of the stream. To make sure we are focusing our efforts where we will have the most impact, we have to understand the system and its geomorphic stability issues through assessment and monitoring, and to prioritize based on the potential benefits to be gained and the degree of confidence that we would have in completing a project effectively that will have a long-term success. So something that won't have to be actively maintained. One tool that we use to help facilitate this process is the stream management plan development, which is a document that pulls the assessment findings and interpretations together to prioritize efforts and make recommendations on stream management actions. The Sopus Creek and many of its tributaries have been assessed in detail, some with repeat assessments now, and a lot of that assessment detail or documentation gets worked into these stream management plans. So we have some management plans that may have been, one-off based off of a single assessment, or if we've done a reassessment, we can update the plan. So it's almost like a living document based on the recurrence of these in the field assessments. So located near Phoenicia, Woodland Creek is one of the largest tributaries to the Upper Esopus Creek watershed. It has a drainage area of just over 20 square miles, which is about 8% of the total Ashokan watershed. We focused on it for assessment because it was observed through turbidity monitoring by our partners at U.S. Geologic Survey to be a major contributor of fine sediment or turbidity. The USGS report that was published in 2014 titled Turbidity and Suspended Sediment in the Upper Esopus Creek Watershed showed on average of 10% of the turbidity observed at our Coldbrook gauge, which is located down here near Boyceville, was coming out of the Woodland Creek drainage basin. So the results of that study warranted a more detailed investigation into Woodland Creek to understand the stream conditions that were leading to this elevated turbidity. Woodland Creek was originally assessed in 2007/8, and then it was reassessed after the major flooding of 2010 and 2011, which kind of caused this eruption of sediment, which we'll see more pictures of later. And the stream management plan was produced for Woodland, and that's what I'll highlight and talk through here in these next couple of slides. So how we go about kind of gathering our thoughts and starting to put stuff to paper in terms of the management plan development is really breaking it up into 3 phases. Our assessment takes this three-phased approach that kind of works initially at the large zoomed out watershed scale and then down to the river or reach or even site scale. So with phase 1 of the analysis, that's mostly done from the comforts of the office. We're looking at a lot of remotely sensed data, old aerial imageries, anything that might have been included in our geodatabase from past assessments or site visits. We also do a pretty rigorous analysis of the past hydrology and flood history. In one sense, we're very fortunate because I think the Ashokan watershed is maybe one of the most instrumented watersheds in the state. So we have a really nice set of stream gauges where we can really get into some detailed flood analysis and look at return intervals of flood events and things like that. Phase 2 is a field data collection. So this is boots on the ground where we're physically out there walking the length of the stream and recording features on a handheld GPS unit. We also photo document many of the sites and take measurements, like kind of rough channel dimensions and whatnot as we're progressing through these assessments. And then the phase 3 would be a more detailed site investigation. That might include something like topographic survey, or currently through support from SLR, we're flying a number of sites utilizing aerial imagery derived from drones to create terrain models. We might be getting into hydraulic modeling through HECRAS and other programs. And then other sites just are slated for long-term monitoring. So we monument through cross sections and traditional survey methods. So a little bit more detail on the phase 1. We pull together the existing data and look at the larger scale watershed and stream corridors. So the valley bottoms, the floodplains, and we start to evaluate the influence of the watershed hydrology, topography, geology, land use, land cover, and any type of other practices like agriculture that may influence the stream. These factors make up the boundaries to the channel and dictate the channel form in many instances, and they influence how flow is routed off the landscape and into the stream network. Many of these characteristics to be looking at this scale, we can't really manage, whether on the site scale or reach scale. So this is kind of the boundary conditions that we're oftentimes set with when we do start to zero in on a site that may require some type of management intervention strategy. Okay. So at the watershed At the watershed and valley, all the watershed and valley parameters that I discussed on the previous slide are never consistent across an entire length of stream. It should be pretty obvious. So to help hone in on and to organize a management strategy, we break the stream up into smaller segments called management units. This is done through that phase 1 assessment and is typically based on things like drainage area, valley confinement, channel slope, geologic boundaries, or land use. Ultimately, getting it down to a management unit with common parameters that will have common management implications. Woodland, as you can see here, the creek that we're talking about is broken up into seven management units, with the most influential factor being drainage areas. So there are a number of larger tributaries contributing to Woodland, and typically that would correspond with where we have a reach break into a different management unit. And the reason for that is just those contributing drainages really affect the channel dimensions that we'd expect to see in the areas below the confluence where they come in. So the more fun aspect, which is where we get to get our feet wet, is in phase 2. This is where we put on our wading gear and directly make field observations on current conditions at the stream and reach scale. In this phase, we're looking at geomorphic stability of the channel and where hazards to property, public infrastructure, or stream system stability are generally a concern. We perform what we call a stream feature inventory, or SFI, where we walk the channel recording these features and attributes with the GPS unit that I mentioned. And all of that is organized in this data dictionary that was co-developed with the DEP, New York City DEP stream management staff, as well as some of the other watershed programs that are active in the west of Hudson watershed. So a lot of the other soil and water districts. So some of the examples of what we'd be recording at this phase are things like bank erosion, where we might record height, length. We'll classify the geology and the bank material. We'll look at things like vegetative cover or protection, the angle of a stream bank, whether or not the erosion that we're observing is hydraulic erosion or mass failure mechanisms. We're also taking a lot of photos and a lot of notes through this phase, so that when we get back to process the data, it gives us that frame of reference as we're starting to write up and make management recommendations. So on Woodland Creek, it took about 11 days for a team of 4 people to walk 6.3 miles of stream, and we collected over 783 features. And so we typically would do this with 4 staff, typically 2 experienced staff and 2 either seasonal employees or interns. We're fortunate to get interns through another DEP program that works through Ulster County Community College. And then also we utilize the Student Conservation Association program, usually with a 10-month intern on most years, and they become an instrumental component and team member for this assessment work. Another tool that we've been piloting with our SFIs more recently is the use of Dave Roskin's banks model, which is the bank assessment for non-point consequences of sediment. It's a mouthful, but it's used to predict erosion rates and sediment loading from stream banks. And this model evaluates and assigns a rating on how vulnerable a stream bank would be to erosion based on a couple of bank characteristics, which are called Bank Erosion Hazard Index, and then a simple estimate of shear stress conditions or near bank stress. These are kind of like rapid assessments that we can do while conducting the stream feature inventory. And many of the parameters that feed into that model are stream feature inventory data that we'd be collecting anyways. So we didn't have to really add too much to get this other data, which we're then able to use with erosion rate curves, which we've developed for our watershed, that lets us start to look at the amount of expected bank retreat on an annual basis. And then we can start to get other data to compare sites based on their potential loading into the stream system. So after we've gone through a QA/QC process with all the field collected data, we can start to get into the data analysis and interpretation. We start to pull all the parts of the story together at the management unit scale, as well as zero in on specific sites that has excessive erosion and consequences to water quality or infrastructure or private property. We look to see what sections of the stream have the most erosion, the most contact with fine sediment sources, being the the fine sediment being the biggest pollutant of concern in the upper Esopus watershed. And other areas where we may see degradation signs such as head cutting, channel aggradation, things like that, that might result in rapid channel movement. So the MU that we're going to be focusing on and talking about a little bit more is this MU7, which is located in the graph to the left bottom of the slide. And you can see, with that management unit, we had the largest amount of erosional contact with lacustrine clay. That lacustrine clay is those old lake sediments that were deposited during the last glaciation. And this allows us to kind of zero in and say that this management unit over all the other management units may be the biggest contributor affecting water quality. We also start to look at an intervention level, and this isn't really a prioritization strategy, but it's more indication of what type of management strategy might be needed at these smaller site scale. And so the four categories that we break it down to are preservation, which would mean that we found like a relatively intact, stable section of stream that should be preserved. Usually that means making sure that there's no major impacts to the riparian vegetation, which would trigger channel response. Passive restoration or monitoring would be sites that have some evidence of degradation or channel evolution going on. But through monitoring, we might see that these sites can self-heal over time and don't require a more intense management strategy, which would be the two other categories, assisted restoration or full restoration. Assisted restoration would be, maybe an example where we have a head cut that we can capture before it propagates upstream and destabilizes more stream banks. So we can kind of work on it on an individual site level, or even maybe a single structure in the stream, as opposed to full restoration, which is typically then moving to, the reach scale restoration type projects that, might be, 1,000 plus or a couple thousand linear feet of stream with a lot of bank and in-channel structures. So going back to our goal of water quality protection and improvement and focusing on the improvement part, we want to seek out sites for reforestation or restoration work, and we want to be able to compare sites across the watershed. So the Woodland Creek assessment had identified just under 10,000 feet of erosion and approximately 3 miles categorized as benefiting from assisted or full restoration. There were 31 erosion sites that made it onto our radar from the assessment, and they were identified as being particularly problematic for 12 of these sites, where there was erosion into the clay-rich deposits, which were mostly those lacustrine lake sediments. So we had gone on to develop a scoring and ranking system to help with our prioritization needs, and that works on a weighted score that looks at things like sediment supply and stream system stability, the presence of fine sediment sources, and turbidity reduction, as well as potential hazards to public and private infrastructure or property. So we pull all this information on each of these sites from the SFIs, such as the erosional area or the area of exposed fine sediment, and then assign a weighted score based on these different characteristics that we're interested in. Then these scores are added up to give an overall site score. And the assumption there would be that the highest ranking site or the highest score would be producing the most amount of sediment. This is an example of how that spreadsheet looks. And we've highlighted this priority ranking number 3, or the third highest ranked site, because this is a site we'll discuss later on in the presentation, which was a site where there was a management intervention. So the nice thing with this rankings model here is that we can actually adjust our prioritization or weighting to each of these different scores. So if we're really focused on water quality, we can prioritize that and weight that score higher, so that it has a higher influence on the total score. Same thing for sediment supply. A lot of times we're interested in sites that may be producing a lot of coarse sediment because that can lead to increased instability downstream. And then the score number 3, or hazard, is really a reflection of the risk to either public or private infrastructure, which a lot of times we might bump that up if we're doing interactions with some of the municipalities to say these are the sites that we've identified as problematic, but also might have the biggest impact on these on this public infrastructure. So getting into the stream management plan itself, all of the information that I just covered works its way into the Woodland Creek Stream Management Plan. The document organizes the results and documents the different phases of the assessment and presents a stream management recommendation on what our program or the county, the town, or private landowners can do to best coexist with the stream. The document is meant to be helpful to a wide range of watershed stakeholders, such as the landowners that live streamside in Woodland Creek, the highway managers who we work very closely with, and community planners and policymakers. So ultimately, it really lays out a summary of our findings. It talks about the programmatic goals and then provides a detailed management unit description. So like, as I'd said, we break everything up into these individual management units. Each section gets a more in-depth discussion of the factors influencing the stream health and stability, and identifies areas where there may be opportunities to make improvements. So this is looking at one of those particular management unit descriptions. It provides a little bit of the management unit characteristics. Talks about things like the amount of channel erosion that were observed from the stream feature inventory. It gets into the levels of intervention that may be needed at some of the different, those 4 categories that we discussed earlier. It identifies any erosion or flood hazards, and then it provides these type of recommendations. So for the example here, you can see at Stream Station 11,000, there's a recommendation to the town of Shandaken, who manages the road up this valley, to evaluate the channel incision and head cutting in this portion that may influence the town there, or destabilize road embankments and things like that. Let's see. So following up on some of those recommendations that come out of the stream management plan, that management unit 7 that I had mentioned and highlighted earlier was an area where we saw a lot of excessive erosional contact with these fine sediments. And you can see that in this upper right photo. The stream was actively flowing pre-construction through bed and bank clay deposits. So these are deposits that were created during the last ice age. When the stream is in contact with them now, it's the first time that these deposits have likely been exposed since the last ice age actually would have made to the deposits. And as we just heard from SLR, they were a project partner on this and had done a lot of the design and construction management work. So you see some of their handiwork here in the bottom right. But ultimately, we had done full channel restoration work for about 1,500 linear feet of channel, removed the channel contacts with several of these contacts with the lacustrine sediment. We protected a private road that was threatened on the upstream portions of the project, and tried to work with, ultimately the stream process to restore that geomorphic stability. Okay. One of the other important components of the stream management plan and the planning process, and one of the activities that often happens either around the time of the stream feature inventory and then closer to publication, is outreach. And the outreach is typically organized and conducted through both Soil and Water, but more so our partners with the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Ulster County. And so they had organized a series of public presentations to the Woodland Valley residents, including a newsletter publication that highlighted some of the findings from the assessment. We also met with individual streamside landowners to discuss their individual needs and concerns. Once they identify their property within a different management unit, a lot of times we'll get contacted to do one-on-one meetings with them and talk about what they might be able to do on their private property to help live a little bit more well with the stream that they're living next to. Let me see what else here. This one was kind of interesting too, because there's a really active landowner association up there. So you can see in this bottom left photo, Tim Koch from our program is out doing some environmental programming with them. And he presented on a number of topics that they were kind of interested in. And then we also were able to organize what we call like a stream walk, where we were able to take the interested landowners within the Woodland Valley and bring them to the restoration site while it was actively under construction, and show them, work through the plans, talk about what the goals of the project were and how it actually benefits downstream landowners. So one other note on how we utilize the stream management plans that have been published. A lot of the other plans, Cornell Cooperative Extension is used to do targeted outreach to municipal officials in the towns of Woodstock and Olive, who were going through the process of developing natural resource inventories, or NRIs. Most notably, they've taken the stream management plan data and management recommendations for the Bushkill, which is town of Olive, and then the Beaverkill and Little Beaverkill, which is town of Woodstock. And we're able to integrate them into the natural resource inventories that the towns were developing in conjunction with DEC and the Hudson River Estuary Program. And in some instances, I believe that some of this can count towards climate resilient points that would make the town eligible for additional funding opportunities. And it also brought the plans, data and recommendations to the attention members of the planning board, the environmental and conservation advisory councils, and zoning boards for those towns. So one further action that was a recommendation for us, the stream management program, was to do additional assessment in the Woodland Creek drainage. Like I mentioned, there were a couple of major tributaries, and those had gone unassessed during the stream feature inventory. So in 2021, we were out and we were able to assess the Pantherkill, which is the largest tributary contributing to the Woodland Creek. Able to walk 2.5 miles of stream, record a whole host of additional data points, and actually identify a site that's been a big contributor of suspended sediment to Woodland Creek, which is being targeted for restoration in the next 2 years. And that's a site on Pantherkill in the lower reaches. We also were able to establish additional bank erosion monitoring sites, which lets us give more data to the erosion rate curves that we've been developing and strengthen those relationships. And then we also partnered with USGS to do some suspended sediment monitoring above and below the Pantherkill site that was targeted to look at the effectiveness of the restoration work in reducing suspended sediment and turbidity. And that is basically it. So I hope I left a little bit of time for questions, but I might have went a little long. So thank you everybody to joining today, and let me know, Emily, if there are any questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Adam. I learned a lot from your talk, so thanks for going through all of those details. We have a question about how flooding gets incorporated into the stream management plan program.
Yeah, so again, we're fortunate in this part of the county that we have updated flood maps from FEMA. So we do look at, the inundation risk areas that are included. And one of the layers that we would include in the management plan at that reach scale would be, the projection of the base flood elevation or the 100-year flood, which is the regulatory flood under FEMA's eyes. So anywhere there may be a structure or something that would be at risk of being in there, we can then talk to those individual landowners about opportunities that may be available through some of the funding streams to, either flood proof, elevate, things like that. So it does get discussed and wrapped into those management plans. Oh, and I should have mentioned the AshokanStreams.org is our website, and all of the plans that have been completed are published there and accessible. You can also find additional information on CatskillStream.org.
Great, thank you. How do you define geomorphic stability or restoration for these projects?
That's a great question. So, streams are obviously in flux, and what we're looking for is really dynamic equilibrium. So geomorphic stability in our eyes would be a site that can handle its water, but also its sediment load that's being delivered to it. So we don't want to see a site that's degraded or degrading, meaning it might be actively incising. And then conversely, we don't want to see a site that's actively aggrading, because that means it's having sediment transport issues and can lead to lateral instability. So we're really looking for that sweet spot in the middle that's a balance between the water and sediment kind of conveyor belt that's being brought through any individual reach or site.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one more question, and that is if and how climate change projections get incorporated into these types of plans.
Yeah, that's a good question. Because we're looking at, obviously, it's discussed within the plans in maybe a broader sense, but on the management unit scale or site scale, it's really hard to make a management recommendation based on the future flood or flows that we're anticipating. I will say that when we go through to do like a site that's been identified for potential restoration work, we go through a pretty robust and iterative modeling process where we can consider future flows. We can bump up our discharge numbers in there to look at what type of shear stresses we might see on the bed and banks, what type of changes there may be to the BFE or something based on those future flows. So it's discussed, I'd say, pretty generally in the management plans, and kind of hard to really incorporate it into those site-specific recommendations. But that geomorphic response is really what we're going to capture as these streams continue to adjust to increases in flow. And that's why these repeat stream feature inventories and repeat assessments are kind of a necessity. So it lets us update the old management plans with that new data and see how the streams may be responding to some of these sites we might not, or some of these assessments we might not get back to for 10 years or 10 plus years. So we might actually start to see some of those changes, increased erosion, things like that.